The historical record of Allegheny in 1886 speaks of coal dust and scripture, a town carved from the unforgiving Appalachian mountainside, held together by little more than shared hardship and a deep, abiding suspicion of the world beyond its forested borders. But between the lines of church ledgers and mining company payrolls lies another story, a darker footnote written in the ink of collective fear. It is the account of a silent figure, a deaf man whose arrival was an omen, and whose presence became a haunting the community could neither comprehend nor escape. For months, he stalked his neighbors in silence, and to this day, no one truly understood what he wanted. If the hushed chronicles of the past are what you seek, and this is your first visit to our archive, consider subscribing. Join us as we unearth the histories that were meant to remain buried. The township of Allegheny was less a community and more a pocket of human tenacity pressed into a deep fold of the earth. Its existence was a testament to the raw, unyielding coal seam that ran like a black artery through the mountain's heart. Life there was governed by two inexorable forces: the rising of the sun, which called the men to the mines, and the tolling of the church bell, which called their families to prayer. The mountains themselves were a constant, looming presence, their peaks shrouded in a perpetual cold fog that would often descend into the valley, swallowing the ramshackle wooden homes and dirt-packed roads in a damp gray shroud. This isolation was both a comfort and a curse. It protected Allegheny from the modern anxieties of the burgeoning cities to the east, but it also bred a unique and potent strain of superstition. The world beyond their valley was a place of rumor and myth, and anything that arrived unbidden from that world was met not with curiosity, but with a deep, instinctual dread. The preacher, a man whose gaunt frame and fervent sermons seemed shaped by the harsh landscape itself, often spoke of this. He warned his congregation that the forests were ancient and watchful, and that a righteous life was the only shield against the shadows that gathered just beyond the flickering lantern light of their settlement. His words found fertile ground in the minds of a populace whose days were spent in literal darkness underground, and whose nights were filled with the unfamiliar sounds of a vast, untamed wilderness. They were a people accustomed to clear dangers, like the shudder of a collapsing mine shaft, or the fever that could sweep through a household in a matter of days. They were not, however, prepared for a danger that had no voice, no name, and no discernible purpose. The first sightings of the deaf man were disparate and easily dismissed, footnotes in the daily ledger of small-town life. A mother, hanging laundry on a line stretched between two skeletal oak trees, paused her work, a clothespin held tight in her fingers. She felt a gaze upon her, a sensation as real and as chilling as a sudden drop in temperature. Her eyes scanned the dense, dark green of the forest edge that bordered her small property. There, standing partially obscured by the trunk of a great pine, was a man. He was unnaturally still, a static figure against the subtle, constant motion of the wilderness. He wore the simple, durable clothing of a laborer, yet his posture was not that of a man at rest. It was one of intense, focused observation. He was not looking at her home, she realized with a jolt of primal fear, but directly at her. She called out, her voice thin and sharp in the cool mountain air, asking if he needed assistance. The man did not move, he did not speak, he simply watched, his expression unreadable from that distance. A sudden gust of wind rattled the wet sheets on the line, momentarily obscuring her view. When they settled, he was gone. The mother mentioned the strange encounter to her husband that evening, a coal miner whose face was permanently smudged with the black dust of his trade. He had given her a brief, humanizing smile, a rare moment of softness in a life defined by hard labor, before dismissing it. He reasoned it was likely a traveler or a hunter, lost on an old trail, but he checked the lock on their cabin door twice that night before blowing out the lamp. Days later, a group of miners trudged up the winding path from the mine entrance at dusk, their bodies aching with the familiar exhaustion of a 10-hour shift. The air was thick with the scent of coal smoke and damp earth. As they rounded a bend, one of them stopped, raising a hand to halt the others. He pointed toward a rocky outcrop that overlooked the path. Seated there was the same silent figure. He was not looking down at them, but past them, his gaze fixed on the twinkling lights of the town nestled in the valley below. The setting sun cast his silhouette in stark relief against the bruised purple and orange of the evening sky. He seemed oblivious to their presence, lost in a silent contemplation that felt both profound and deeply unsettling. The men exchanged uneasy glances. They were rough men, accustomed to confrontation, but something about the man's profound stillness held them back. There was no threat in his posture, yet his presence felt like a violation, an intrusion into the predictable rhythm of their lives. One of the miners, bolder than the rest, shouted up at him, his voice echoing in the twilight stillness. He asked the man his name and his business in Allegheny. The figure did not turn his head. He gave no sign that he had heard. It was as if their words were no more significant than the rustling of leaves in the breeze. They continued on their way, the image of the silent observer seared into their minds. That night, in the town's only tavern, the story was told and retold, each telling adding a new layer of detail, a new shade of menace. The children were the next to encounter him. A small group of them were playing a game of hide-and-seek in a fallow cornfield, the dry stalks rustling around them like the whispers of old ghosts. One of the younger boys, seeking a new hiding place, ran toward the edge of the field where it met a dense thicket of woods. He stopped abruptly. Standing just inside the tree line, cloaked in the deep shadows of the late afternoon, was the man. He was watching them play, his head tilted slightly as if listening to a conversation he could not possibly hear. The boy felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The man's gaze was not unkind, but it was unnervingly patient, like a predator studying its prey, learning its habits, its patterns, its vulnerabilities. The boy let out a small, choked cry and ran back to his friends, his face pale with a fear he could not articulate. He told them a man was watching from the woods. When they all turned to look, the space among the trees was empty. Only the shifting shadows remained. These individual encounters, at first isolated ripples of unease, soon began to converge into a single, terrifying wave of collective anxiety. The figure was no longer a stranger. He was a presence, a silent specter that haunted the periphery of their community. Who was this man, and what did his silent, ceaseless observation portend for the insulated world of Allegheny? The question of his silence became the central preoccupation of the town. In a community where life was loud, defined by the clang of hammers, the rumble of mining carts, and the boisterous chatter of communal life, his absolute lack of sound was an anomaly so profound it felt like a tear in the fabric of their reality. Several attempts were made to bridge this unnerving chasm. A town elder, a man respected for his calm demeanor and years of experience mediating disputes, organized a small party of men to approach the stranger directly. They found him one morning standing near the town well, seemingly oblivious to the women who gave him a wide, fearful berth as they drew their water for the day. The elder stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral. He spoke slowly and clearly, using simple words. He offered the man food. He offered him shelter. He asked, with genuine concern lacing his tone, if the man was lost or in some kind of trouble. The deaf man turned his head to look at the elder, and for the first time, several of the townsfolk saw his face up close. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, and they held an expression of deep, impenetrable sorrow. But he did not respond to the elder's words. He made no gesture of acceptance or refusal. He simply met the elder's gaze and held it, a silent, unblinking stare that seemed to last an eternity. The other men grew restless. One of them, a blacksmith whose powerful hands were clenched into fists, stepped forward and spoke in a loud, commanding voice, as if the sheer volume of his words could breach the wall of silence. He demanded to know the man's purpose. He said his lurking was frightening the women and children. The deaf man's expression did not change. His gaze remained fixed, his body perfectly still. The encounter ended in a frustrating and unnerving stalemate. The men retreated, their sense of order and control completely undermined. They had offered help and issued demands, the two primary modes of communication they understood, and both had been met with the same placid, unnerving silence. It was this that began to shift the town's perception of him. His deafness, initially perceived as a misfortune, a simple physical ailment, began to feel like something else entirely. It felt intentional. It was not an absence of hearing, they whispered to one another, but a refusal to communicate. His silence was not a void. It was a weapon, a tool of intimidation that left them feeling powerless and exposed. The preacher seized upon this growing fear. From his pulpit the following Sunday, he did not mention the man directly, but his sermon was unmistakable. He spoke of omens, of spirits sent to test the faith of the righteous. He warned that evil often came in a quiet, unassuming guise, that it would not announce itself with thunder and lightning, but with a subtle, creeping dread. He said, a silence that could not be broken by the word of God was a cursed silence. The congregation listened, their hearts heavy with a shared, unspoken terror. The mysterious figure was no longer just a man. He was a symbol, a vessel for all the anxieties and superstitions that had festered for generations in the dark, isolated heart of their Appalachian home. The transition from communal unease to outright fear was finalized by the testimony of a single child. One evening, as a family sat down for their meager supper of stew and hard bread, their youngest daughter, a girl of no more than 7 years, seemed unusually quiet and withdrawn. Her mother, a woman whose gentle nature belied a fierce protective instinct, noticed her daughter's untouched food and the tremor in her small hands. She knelt by the child's chair and asked what was wrong. The girl hesitated, her eyes wide with a terror that seemed too large for her small face. Then, in a halting whisper, she recounted her walk home from a friend's house, just before sunset. She said she had felt someone watching her. When she looked back, she saw the silent man standing at the far end of the road. She had quickened her pace, her heart hammering against her ribs. But every time she dared to glance over her shoulder, he was there, maintaining the same distance, his long strides easily matching her panicked scurrying. He made no sound. He did not call out or run. He simply followed. She said he followed her all the way to the edge of their property, stopping at the tree line, where he stood and watched her run inside. He was still there, she whispered, watching the house from the darkness of the trees. The child's father, a man of quiet disposition but immense physical strength, rose from the table without a word. He took his heavy hunting rifle from its place above the mantelpiece and stepped outside into the cold, dark night. He stood on his porch for nearly an hour, the rifle resting in the crook of his arm, his eyes scanning the impenetrable blackness of the forest. He saw nothing. He heard nothing but the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a lone wolf. But when he came back inside, the fear that had taken root in his daughter's heart had spread to his own. This was not a chance encounter. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate act of intimidation. The story spread through Allegheny like a contagion. The man was no longer just a watcher. He was a stalker. He had crossed an invisible line, bringing his silent haunting from the periphery of the town to the very doorstep of one of its families. The community's vague sense of unease hardened, overnight, into the cold, sharp certainty of fear. They now understood that this was not a coincidence, that this silent, solitary figure had chosen them. The question that now burned in every mind, whispered in every home, and prayed over in every church pew, was no longer who he was, but what, in the name of God, did he want from them? The fragile peace that had once characterized the township of Allegheny was irrevocably broken. The child's story of being followed to her very doorstep acted as a lit match tossed into the dry kindling of the community's fear. What had been a series of unsettling but disconnected events now coalesced into a single, terrifying narrative of a predator who had chosen their isolated valley as his hunting ground. The fear was no longer a specter haunting the edges of their lives. It had crossed their thresholds and taken a seat at their dinner tables. It manifested not in loud panicked cries, but in a heavy, watchful silence that mirrored the one they so dreaded. The days grew shorter, and as the autumn chill deepened, the nights in Allegheny became long vigils of anxiety. A collective paranoia began to set in, a psychological contagion that spread from house to house with the quiet efficiency of a creeping frost. The whispers started, carrying on the cold night air from one lantern-lit porch to another. Families, who had once left their doors unbarred as a sign of trust in their neighbors, now checked their locks and bolted their shutters before the last light of day had faded from the sky. The strange occurrences began to multiply, each one a small, inexplicable tear in the mundane fabric of their lives. A mother would wake in the deep, pre-dawn cold, a chill upon her skin that had nothing to do with the temperature. She would find the heavy wooden door to her family's cabin, which she was certain she had barred the night before, standing slightly ajar, creaking softly on its iron hinges. A thin sliver of the gray, misty morning would be visible, an unwelcome intrusion of the outside world. A frantic inventory of their meager possessions would reveal that nothing of value had been taken. The salted meat hanging from the rafters was untouched. The small pouch of coins in the ceramic jar remained, but a single, insignificant object would be missing. A carving knife from the kitchen block, a length of rope from a peg by the door, a whetstone used for sharpening tools. The thefts were pointless, serving no logical purpose, which made them all the more terrifying. They were not acts of desperation, but acts of intrusion, subtle messages that the sanctity of their homes had been breached, that their lives were being observed with an intimate and unnerving curiosity. The feeling of violation was profound. It was the knowledge that while they slept, a silent, unknown presence had been inside their walls, moving through their space, its motives as inscrutable as the darkness from which it came. Elsewhere, a farmer, rising with the sun to begin his morning chores, discovered a strange marking on the weathered wood of his barn. Drawn in what appeared to be white chalk was a crude, angular symbol, a series of intersecting lines that resembled no letter or known sigil. It was placed directly over the latch, a deliberate and unmissable sign. The farmer, a man whose life was dictated by the predictable cycles of the seasons, felt a surge of cold fury. He scrubbed at the mark with a wet rag, the chalk dust mixing with the morning dew and running down the door like pale tears. Though the symbol was gone, its image was burned into his memory. He found himself glancing at the barn door throughout the day, half expecting the mark to have reappeared. He told no one, fearing the ridicule of his neighbors. But that night he sat awake in a chair by his window, his shotgun laid across his lap, his eyes fixed on the dark, hulking shape of the barn. He was guarding against an enemy he could not name, for a crime he could not comprehend. These incidents, small and isolated, became the currency of the town's fear. They were shared in hushed tones over picket fences and in the dim light of the general store. Each story confirmed the others, building a mosaic of dread. The silent man was no longer just watching, he was acting, touching their lives in small, deliberate ways, leaving behind a trail of psychological torment. His interactions with the town's children grew bolder, and it was these encounters that caused the most profound terror. He seemed drawn to them, not with the overt menace of a predator, but with a strange, sorrowful intensity. One afternoon, a group of children were skipping stones by the creek that snaked through the valley. The deaf man appeared on the opposite bank, his sudden presence silencing their laughter. He did not cross the water. He simply stood there, his pale eyes fixed upon them. Then, he began to move. He raised his hands, his fingers splayed, and began to perform a series of slow, deliberate gestures. They were not the wild gesticulations of a madman, but a sequence of controlled, specific movements. He pointed a finger toward the ground at his feet, then swept his arm in a wide arc, indicating the dense, dark woods that rose up behind him. He then brought his hands together and made a motion as if he were digging, his body mimicking the strain of lifting a heavy shovel. Finally, he looked at them, his expression one of desperate, pleading urgency, and tapped his own chest twice. The children watched, mesmerized and uncomprehending. The gestures were alien, a language they did not speak. To them, it was a bizarre and frightening pantomime. A mother, who had come to call her children home for supper, saw the scene from a distance. All she registered was a strange man, a known lurker, making frantic motions at a group of vulnerable children. She let out a scream of pure, unadulterated terror, which sent the children scrambling toward her. By the time she had gathered them up, her arms wrapped around them like a shield. The man on the opposite bank had vanished back into the trees. The story of his strange miming spread like wildfire, stripped of all its nuance. The town heard only that the silent man had been attempting to lure their children into the woods. The possibility that he had been trying to communicate, to warn them, was never even considered. His silence had already condemned him. The simmering pot of communal paranoia finally boiled over. The incident that tipped the balance was provided by a coal miner, a man known for his quiet sobriety and steady hand. He had been walking home later than usual, his path lit only by the swinging arc of his oil lantern. The flickering light cast long, dancing shadows that turned familiar trees into monstrous shapes. As he took a well-worn shortcut through a small copse of pine trees, the light of his lantern fell upon a figure standing just off the path. It was the deaf man, motionless as ever. The miner froze, his hand tightening around the handle of his lantern. For a long, terrifying moment, the two of them stood in silence, separated by no more than 20 feet of darkness. The miner raised his lantern higher, hoping the sudden brightness might startle the man away. In that brief, clarifying burst of light, the miner swore he saw it. The deaf man's lips, which he had only ever seen set in a line of sorrowful neutrality, curled upward at the corners. It was not a friendly smile. It was a wide, unnerving, and utterly soundless grin. The sight broke the miner's paralysis. He turned and ran, not stopping until he burst through the door of the tavern, his chest heaving, his face as white as a sheet. His story was the final piece of evidence the town needed. A smile in the dark, a silent, malevolent acknowledgement, confirmed their worst fears. He was not simply lost or troubled. He was dangerous. He was toying with them, deriving some perverse pleasure from their terror. That night, an informal council of war was held in the tavern. The town elders, Men who had always preached caution and deliberation found their voices drowned out by a rising tide of fear and anger. The mothers, their faces etched with worry, spoke of their children's nightmares, of their refusal to play outside. They demanded that the men do something to protect their families. The miners, their hands stained with coal and their hearts filled with a righteous fury, spoke of taking matters into their own hands. They were not men to be trifled with, they argued. They would not live in fear of a single, silent vagrant. The preacher, who had been sitting quietly in a corner, finally rose to speak. His voice cut through the clamor. He told them that they were facing a test of their collective soul. He said that to allow such a presence to remain in their midst was to invite the devil himself to sit at their hearth. He spoke of curses and of men who walked without the grace of God, their silence a sign of their soullessness. His words turned their fear into a holy crusade. The debate was over. The question was no longer if he was a threat, but how that threat should be eliminated. Was he simply a misunderstood soul, a man trapped in a world without sound, desperately trying to make a connection he did not know how to forge? Or was there a hidden, malevolent design behind his ceaseless, silent watch? The town of Allegheny, in its rising panic, had already chosen its answer. The transition from suspicion to a verdict of guilty was sealed by a sudden and shocking event. A farmer, a man known for his stubborn temperament and his prize-winning sow, vanished without a trace. He had gone out one afternoon to mend a fence at the far edge of his property, the part that bordered the dense, untamed forest. He did not return for supper. His wife, a woman of nervous disposition, waited for an hour before her anxiety overwhelmed her. She alerted her closest neighbors, and soon a small search party was formed. They searched through the twilight hours, their lanterns cutting feeble paths through the encroaching darkness. They found his tools lying abandoned by the broken section of fence. They found his hat caught on a thorny bush a few yards into the woods, but of the farmer himself, there was no sign. The search continued the next day, with nearly every able-bodied man in Allegheny combing the woods. It was a young boy who provided the final, damning piece of information. He had been fishing in the creek that afternoon and had seen the farmer. He reported that the farmer had not been alone. He had been standing at the edge of the woods, arguing with the deaf man. The boy could not hear the words, of course, but he described the farmer's face as red with anger, his arms waving wildly. And he described the deaf man, standing perfectly still, watching the farmer's tirade with his usual unnerving calm. The news fell upon the town like a death sentence. The whispers of strange occurrences and chalk marks transformed into a certainty of foul play. The haunting had escalated to violence. The silent stranger was no longer just a stalker. In the terrified minds of the people of Allegheny, he was now a murderer. The disappearance of the farmer acted as a solvent upon the already fractured composure of Allegheny. With a man now missing and presumed dead, the fear that had been a constant, low hum in the background of their lives crescendoed into a deafening roar of panic and accusation. The silent man, once a mere object of suspicion, was now tried and convicted in the court of public opinion. He was the sole focus of their collective rage, a vessel into which they poured all their terror of the unknown. The men began to organize patrols, armed with rifles and pitchforks, their faces grim in the flickering torchlight. They were no longer simply guarding their homes, they were hunting. Yet, amid this rising tide of violent certainty, a single, dissenting thought began to form in the quietest and most educated corner of the community. It resided in the mind of the schoolteacher, a woman who had arrived in Allegheny only 2 years prior, bringing with her a world of books and ideas that stood in stark contrast to the town's deep-rooted superstitions. She was a woman of logic and observation, and the narrative being woven by the townsfolk felt to her dangerously incomplete. The schoolteacher's small, one-room schoolhouse was an island of quiet reason in a sea of escalating hysteria. While the rest of the town spoke of the deaf man as a demon or a savage, she found herself replaying the accounts of his behavior, not as evidence of his guilt, but as a puzzle to be solved. She was, by nature and profession, a student of communication. Her life was dedicated to the belief that every mind held the capacity for reason, if only one could find the correct language to reach it. The town saw the man's silence as a void, an absence of humanity. She began to wonder if it was not an absence at all, but a different kind of presence, a form of expression they were simply too frightened to see. Her one humanizing detail was a profound, almost scholarly fascination with puzzles, a trait that had made her an excellent educator but an outsider in this town of simple certainties. She sat alone at her desk long after the children had been hurried home by their anxious parents, the scent of chalk dust and old paper thick in the air. She listened, in her memory, to the children's fearful descriptions of the man's gestures by the creek. She had dismissed them at the time, her first instinct being to comfort their fear. Now, she considered them with a new, analytical clarity. She took out a piece of slate and a fresh stick of chalk. She asked one of the older girls, the most observant of her students, to recount exactly what she had seen. The girl, her voice trembling, described the motions again. The man had pointed to the ground. He had swept his arm toward the woods. He had made a digging motion. He had tapped his chest. The schoolteacher sketched the movements as the child described them, her chalk strokes quick and precise on the dark slate. Seen as a sequence of abstract shapes, stripped of the terror that had accompanied their initial viewing, the gestures took on a different quality. They felt less like a threat and more like a set of instructions, a desperate and unsophisticated attempt at narration. A memory stirred in the back of her mind, a passage from a book she had read years ago in a Boston library. It was a treatise on the emerging methods of educating the deaf, a field still considered radical by many. The author had argued that the deaf, denied the avenue of speech, often developed their own rudimentary sign systems, languages born of pure gesture and environmental context. The book had contained illustrations, crude drawings of hands shaping ideas, a flat palm for stop, a pointed finger for look, a scooping motion for take. Looking at the crude symbols she had drawn on her slate, the schoolteacher felt a profound intellectual shudder. She recognized, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, what she was looking at. It was not madness, it was language. It was a crude, fragmented, and desperate dialect of sign. The man's silence was not a refusal to communicate. It was a desperate, failed attempt. This realization shifted her entire perception of the events that had transpired. She felt a sudden, urgent need to find more evidence of this silent language. She remembered the whispers about the farmer who had discovered a chalk mark on his barn door before he vanished. While the rest of the town saw it as a sinister brand, a mark of death, she now wondered if it was something else entirely, a word, a symbol, part of the message. Under the cover of a moonless, overcast night, she slipped out of her small living quarters behind the schoolhouse, a single lantern held low to the ground. She made her way to the abandoned farm, the silence of the place heavy with tragedy and fear. The farmer's wife was staying with relatives in another part of the county, leaving the property deserted. The schoolteacher found the barn, its great wooden door a wall of blackness in the night. She ran her hand over the rough-hewn planks, her fingers searching for any irregularity. Then she found it. Though the farmer had tried to scrub it away, a faint, ghostly residue of the chalk remained, embedded in the grain of the wood. She held her lantern close, the warm, yellow light illuminating the faint white lines. The symbol was exactly as the whispers had described it, a series of sharp, intersecting angles. Her breath caught in her throat. She held up her free hand and, with a tremor of discovery, replicated one of the gestures the children had described, a motion of pointing downward and then drawing a line. The shape her hand made in the air, if traced, would form a symbol nearly identical to the one on the barn door. The chalk mark was a written form of the gesture. He was not just speaking with his hands, he was writing with them. A new, more terrifying question began to form in her mind. If this was a message, what was it trying to say? The conviction grew that there must be more signs. Over the next 2 days, she conducted a secret, perilous investigation. She told no one of her theory, knowing it would be dismissed as the fanciful speculation of an educated woman who did not understand the true nature of evil. She walked the paths on the edge of the town, her eyes scanning not the horizon, but the trees and rocks that lined the well-worn trails. She soon found another. Carved into the smooth gray bark of a beech tree near the creek was a different symbol, this one a crude circle with a single, sharp line drawn through its center. She recognized this gesture too, from the children's account, the man sweeping his arm in a wide arc. This was the sign for the woods, or perhaps the entire area. He was creating a lexicon, a key to understanding his silent vocabulary. As she stared at the carving, she realized its location was significant. It was placed less than 100 yards from the spot where, 3 years earlier, a child from the town had slipped on the wet rocks and drowned in the creek. The memory sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. Was this a coincidence, or was the sign a marker? Driven by a mixture of academic curiosity and a growing sense of dread, she pressed on. She found a third symbol, the sign for digging, scratched into the flat surface of a large stone that overlooked the entrance to the oldest, now defunct section of the coal mine. It was a place heavy with the memory of loss, the site of a minor collapse a decade prior that had claimed the lives of 2 brothers. The schoolteacher felt as though she were walking through a graveyard, following a map of the town's own sorrows laid out by an unknown cartographer. He was not just communicating, he was creating a geography of their grief. He was linking his silent words to the places that had already been marked by death. Back in the sanctuary of her schoolhouse, with the doors barred and the curtains drawn, she worked by the flickering light of a single candle. The chalk dust floated in the warm air like tiny, spectral motes. She drew a rough map of Allegheny and its surroundings from memory. She marked the location of each symbol she had found: the barn of the missing farmer, the beech tree by the creek, the rock by the old mine entrance. A horrifying pattern began to emerge. The symbols formed a clear, deliberate line. They were not random warnings scattered throughout the wilderness. They were waypoints, leading from one site of past tragedy to the next. The line began at the edge of town, touched upon the places of past death, and pointed, with an unnerving, geometric precision, directly toward the dense, uncharted forest behind the missing farmer's property. The message was no longer just a collection of disconnected words. It was a sentence. It was a map. The central, terrifying question remained. Was he trying to warn them of a danger that lay at the end of this path of sorrow, or was he trying to lure them into it? The symbols were a record of their dead, a history of their losses. Was he the author of a new chapter in that history, or was he merely its reluctant messenger? The schoolteacher was now the sole keeper of a truth far more complex and terrifying than the simple story of a monstrous villain the town had chosen to believe. His silence was not an absence of meaning, but a surplus of it. It was a language of grief, a cartography of death, and it was pointing them toward a final, unknown destination. Her discovery placed a terrible burden upon her. She could not keep this knowledge to herself, but to whom could she turn? The town was in the grip of a mob mentality, and her complex, unsettling theory would be seen as heresy. Nevertheless, she knew she had to try. She chose to approach the town elder, the same man who had first attempted to speak with the silent stranger. She found him on his porch, his face a mask of worry as he watched another armed patrol march down the main road. She laid out her findings for him, her voice low and urgent. She showed him her sketches of the symbols, her hand-drawn map, her theory of a silent language. The elder listened, his expression shifting from skepticism to a deep, troubled confusion. He did not dismiss her. He saw the logic in her deductions, as terrifying as they were. But before he could formulate a response, another figure emerged from the twilight shadows. It was the preacher. He had overheard their conversation. He strode onto the porch, his eyes burning with a righteous fire. He snatched the piece of paper with the sketched symbols from the schoolteacher's hand. He held it up to the fading light, his lip curling in disgust. He did not see a language. He did not see a map. He saw the scrawls of a devil worshipper, the secret sigils of a dark covenant. He turned to the elder, his voice booming with absolute certainty. He declared that this was the final proof they needed. He said the man was not just a murderer, but a sorcerer, marking their land with his unholy script. The schoolteacher tried to interject, to explain the linguistic patterns, the semiotic connections, but her words were drowned out by the preacher's furious condemnation. He held the map aloft for the passing patrol to see. He told them the silent man had been placing curses upon their town, and that this foolish woman had been taken in by his devil's work. The seed of doubt the schoolteacher had planted in the elder's mind was instantly uprooted and consumed by the preacher's inferno of certainty. The town no longer had to live, haunted by a mystery. They now had a mission, a holy cause. They would not wait to be lured into a trap. They would not be terrorized by strange markings. They would act. They would purge the evil from their lands, once and for all. The preacher's declaration was the spark that ignited the smoldering embers of Allegheny's fear into a raging inferno of mob justice. His words, amplified by the acoustics of the narrow valley and the echo chamber of their shared paranoia, transformed the townsfolk from frightened victims into righteous crusaders. The complex, nuanced theory proposed by the schoolteacher was utterly consumed by the simple, powerful narrative of good versus evil. There was no longer room for interpretation, no space for doubt. The symbols were not a language to be deciphered, but a sacrilege to be erased. The silent man was not a messenger to be understood, but a demon to be cast out. The delicate, fragile possibility of communication was shattered, and in its place rose the iron certainty of violence. The decision to act was not made through reasoned debate, but through a collective, primal roar of affirmation. Allegheny, a community that had for months been paralyzed by a creeping, atmospheric dread, was now energized by the intoxicating promise of a clear and final resolution. The hunt began as the last vestiges of daylight bled from the sky, staining the western horizon a deep, bruised purple. The men of the town, their faces illuminated by the wild, dancing light of hastily lit torches, gathered in the central square. They were no longer just husbands and fathers. They were a singular entity, a mob bound together by a shared purpose and a shared terror. The miners, their powerful shoulders and calloused hands accustomed to wielding heavy tools, now gripped hunting rifles and sharpened pickaxes. The farmers, who knew the land with an intimacy born of seasons of toil, carried heavy wooden clubs and scythes that glinted menacingly in the firelight. Even the town's merchants and the blacksmith, men of commerce and craft, were present, their usual tools of trade repurposed into crude but effective weapons. The air was thick with the smell of pine pitch from the torches, sweat, and a palpable, metallic tang of impending violence. The preacher stood on the steps of the church, his gaunt figure casting a long, distorted shadow. He did not speak of forgiveness or mercy. He spoke of purification. He raised a hand and pointed toward the dark, looming silhouette of the forest. He told them to cleanse the woods, to drive the shadow from their valley, to reclaim their homes in the name of God. His words were a benediction for the brutality that was to follow. The mob moved out, a river of flickering light and angry sound flowing up the dirt road toward the woods. The dogs, sensing the primal energy of their masters, barked and strained at their leashes, their frantic cries echoing off the silent mountainside. They were a force of pure, kinetic rage, a chaotic and terrifying spectacle against the profound stillness of the Appalachian night. They entered the forest not with the stealth of hunters, but with the clamor of an invading army. They shouted and crashed through the undergrowth, their torches cutting wild, erratic swaths of light through the absolute blackness between the ancient trees. They were not searching for a man, they were flushing out a beast, convinced that their noise and fury would be enough to corner him. They followed the path laid out by the schoolteacher's stolen map, the very route she had believed was a desperate attempt at communication. In their hands, it was a weapon, a direct line to their quarry. They found the carved beech tree by the creek and the marked stone by the old mine, and at each location, their fury was stoked anew. They saw these symbols not as clues, but as profane altars that had to be desecrated. They hacked at the bark of the tree with axes, chipping away the silent man's word until it was nothing but a pulpy, unrecognizable scar. They took their heavy mining hammers to the stone, smashing the carved symbol into dust. With each act of destruction, they felt their resolve harden, their actions justified. For hours, they crashed through the forest, their initial fervor slowly giving way to a grim, dogged determination. The woods, which they had known their whole lives, seemed different in the dark, more menacing, the familiar paths twisting into confusing, labyrinthine trails. The silence they sought to vanquish seemed to mock them, swallowing their shouts and the sounds of their passage, leaving only the heavy panting of their own breath and the frantic beating of their own hearts. Just as a weary frustration began to set in, a triumphant cry went up from the front of the party. The dogs had found a scent. The mob surged forward, renewed with a fresh jolt of adrenaline. The barking led them to a small, hidden clearing near the river, a place where the trees thinned and the faint light of a slivered moon could penetrate the dense canopy. And there, standing at the center of the clearing, his back to the rushing water, was the deaf man. He was not cornered like a frightened animal. He was waiting. He stood with an unnatural stillness, his pale eyes reflecting the torchlight, giving them the appearance of glowing embers. He showed no fear, no surprise. He simply watched them emerge from the darkness, his expression one of profound, tragic resignation, as if he had been expecting them, as if this brutal confrontation was the inevitable, final act of a play he had been forced to perform. His silence, which had always been so unsettling, was now infuriating. To the mob, it was the ultimate act of defiance, a contemptuous refusal to acknowledge their power, their rage, their righteousness. They wanted him to beg, to cry out, to confess. His placid stillness was a mirror, and in it, they could see only their own escalating brutality. The preacher was the first to speak, his voice hoarse with a mixture of exertion and righteous fury. He held a wooden cross aloft, and commanded the demon to show itself. The deaf man did not react. A miner, emboldened by the preacher's fervor, stepped forward and leveled his rifle. He shouted at the man to get on his knees. Again, there was only silence. This was the final breaking point. The mob's collective rage, held in check for so long, finally exploded. They descended upon him. It was not a fight. It was a storm of violence, a chaotic and merciless beating. They struck him with their fists, with their clubs, with the butts of their rifles. He did not fight back. He did not raise his hands to defend himself. He simply absorbed the blows, his body collapsing inward under the sheer weight of their hatred. He crumpled to the forest floor, his stillness finally broken, but his silence remained absolute. He uttered no cry of pain, no grunt of resistance. He was a silent effigy upon which they vented all the fear and anxiety that had plagued them for months. They beat him until their arms grew heavy, until their rage was spent, leaving only a sickening, hollow exhaustion in its place. He lay broken on the damp earth, a crumpled heap in the flickering torchlight. They had not intended to kill him, not explicitly. They had wanted to banish him, to break him, to force a sound, any sound, from his silent throat. A grim debate took place over his motionless body. Some, their bloodlust still running high, argued for finishing the job, for hanging him from the nearest tree and leaving his body as a warning. Others, a nascent sense of shame beginning to curdle in their stomachs, argued that enough had been done. They had driven the evil out. They had shown him their strength. The preacher, his face splattered with mud and his knuckles raw, made the final decision. He said their purpose was to purge, not to murder. To kill him would be to make a martyr of him. He told them to cast him into the river, to let the current carry him away, to let the wilderness from which he came reclaim him. Two of the strongest miners hoisted his limp body between them. They carried him to the riverbank and, with a final, grunting heave, threw him into the cold, black water. He landed with a heavy splash that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet of the aftermath. The current caught him immediately, pulling him away from the shore, his body turning slowly in the dark, fast-moving water. The mob watched as he was carried downstream, his form quickly swallowed by the night. They watched until they could see him no more. They trudged back to their town, the adrenaline of the chase and the violence ebbing away, leaving a cold, uneasy silence in its wake. Their torches seemed to burn less brightly now, their shouts of triumph replaced by a grim, wordless procession. Did they just rid themselves of a great and terrible evil, as the preacher had promised, or had they, in their fear and their ignorance, just committed one? They arrived back in Allegheny as the first pale light of dawn was breaking, illuminating a town that felt strangely unchanged. They had faced their demon and cast him out. A great, collective sigh of relief settled over the community. The ordeal, they told themselves, was finally over. The silence had been vanquished. But as they returned to their homes, the image of the man's still, silent form being taken by the river was seared into their minds. They had filled the woods with their noise, their rage, their violence. And yet, the only thing they had truly accomplished was to create a new, more profound, and more terrifying silence. A deceptive and fragile sense of normalcy descended upon Allegheny in the weeks following the violent banishment of the deaf man. The townsfolk, having lanced the boil of their collective fear, were desperate to believe the fever had broken. The men returned to the coal mines, the rhythmic clang of pickaxe on rock a reassuringly familiar sound. The women resumed their daily routines, the familiar gossip over garden fences now carefully avoiding any mention of the silent stranger. The children were once again allowed to play in the fields and by the creek, their laughter a deliberate and defiant reclamation of the spaces that had been tainted by dread. The preacher's sermons took on a triumphant tone, casting the mob's brutal act as a victory of faith over darkness, a testament to the strength and righteousness of their small, isolated flock. They had faced an unknown evil, he proclaimed, and they had not faltered. They had purged the shadow from their valley. But this performance of peace was a thin veneer stretched taut over a deep and unacknowledged disquiet. The relief they so desperately sought was fleeting, a phantom that receded whenever the sun went down. The nights in Allegheny were different now. The silence that returned to the valley after the men had stormed the woods was not the peaceful, comforting quiet they had known before. It was a heavier, more watchful silence, pregnant with the memory of their own violence. Every creak of a floorboard, every rustle of leaves in the wind, every snap of a twig in the surrounding forest was now imbued with a new and sinister significance. They had cast the man out, but the haunting he had brought with him remained, an invisible miasma that clung to the town like the persistent mountain fog. The first sighting was so improbable, so utterly impossible, that it was initially dismissed as a trick of the light, a hallucination born of a guilty conscience. A gravedigger, a man whose morbid profession had left him largely immune to the superstitions that plagued his neighbors, was finishing his work in the town cemetery as dusk settled. The cemetery was a stark, windswept hill that overlooked the town, its crooked headstones like a mouthful of broken teeth silhouetted against the fading light. He had been a part of the mob, a reluctant participant swept up in the hysteria, and the memory of the man's broken body hitting the water had not sat well with him. As he shouldered his shovel and turned to leave, a movement at the far edge of the cemetery caught his eye. There, standing by the low stone wall that separated the consecrated ground from the untamed wilderness, was a figure. The gravedigger's blood ran cold. It was him, the deaf man. He was not bruised or broken. His clothes were not the tattered river-soaked rags they should have been. He was exactly as he had been before, unnaturally still, his form a perfect, unwavering silhouette against the twilight sky. He was expressionless, his pale eyes fixed not on the gravedigger, but on the town below, a silent, spectral sentinel watching over the graves of their dead. The gravedigger fled, his heart hammering against his ribs. He did not tell anyone what he had seen. Who would believe him? They had all seen the man beaten, broken, and swallowed by the river. To suggest he had returned, untouched and unchanged, was to suggest something beyond the realm of human possibility. It was to suggest that what they had attacked was not a man of flesh and blood at all. But the gravedigger was not the only one. Soon, others began to see him. A woman, sitting by her window and mending a shirt by candlelight, looked up and saw him standing across the road, partially obscured by the shadows of a great oak tree. He was there for only a moment, a fleeting apparition, and then he was gone. A pair of miners, walking home late from the tavern, both saw a figure watching them from a ridge overlooking the path, his form unmistakable even in the deep gloom. They did not speak of it to each other until the next morning, each man afraid the other would think him drunk or mad. The sightings were always the same, brief, silent, and at a distance. He never tried to approach. He never made a gesture. He simply appeared, a quiet and impossible accusation, before vanishing back into the shadows. The community, which had been so loud in its unified rage, was now silent in its shared, unspoken terror. To acknowledge his return was to acknowledge that their violence had been meaningless, a futile act of rage against something they could not comprehend, let alone destroy. They had driven him away, but his presence, his essence, had returned, more potent and more terrifying than before. He was no longer just a stalker. He was a ghost, a living specter that haunted the periphery of their lives, a constant reminder of the brutality they had committed. The haunting soon moved from the periphery to their very doorsteps, becoming more intimate and more unnerving. Families, huddled in their cabins against the deepening autumn chill, began to hear a soft, insistent knocking at their windows in the dead of night. It was not the sharp, percussive rap of a visitor, but a gentle, almost hesitant tapping, like the brush of a bare branch against the glass. But when the man of the house, his courage bolstered by a lit lantern and a loaded rifle, would fling open the door, he would find nothing. The porch would be empty, the yard would be still. There were never any footprints in the mud, never any sign of a human presence. Yet, the sound would return, night after night, a quiet, persistent summons from an unseen source. The fear this created was of a different quality than before. The man's physical presence had been frightening, but it was tangible. This was something else. This was a presence that could touch their homes without being seen, a force that could make its existence known without ever revealing itself. The silence he embodied was now, impossibly, an active and supernatural force. It was the children, as always, who became the primary conduits for this new phase of the haunting. They were more receptive, their minds not yet hardened by the rigid certainties of the adult world. They began to speak of dreams. Several children, from different families who had no contact with one another, reported having the exact same nightmare. In the dream, they were standing in a field of dead, gray grass under a starless, black sky. The silent man was there with them. He was not menacing. His expression, they said, was one of overwhelming sadness. He would look at them, his pale eyes pleading, and then he would raise a single, trembling hand and point toward the ground at his feet. He would then open his mouth, his lips forming words they could not hear, a desperate, silent monologue that was more frustrating than frightening. The children would wake up from this dream not screaming, but with a profound sense of sorrow and a strange, inexplicable compulsion. One child's mother reported waking in the middle of the night to find her daughter's bed empty. In a panic, she found the little girl outside in the yard, dressed only in her thin nightgown, digging at the cold, hard earth with her bare hands, tears streaming down her face. When the mother asked what she was doing, the girl looked up, her eyes wide and unfocused, and said only that he had told her to. The cemetery, the place of his first reappearance, became a focal point of this new, surreal terror. He was seen there frequently now, a still and silent figure moving among the headstones as if taking a census of the dead. He seemed to have a particular affinity for the newest graves, the plots of earth that were still fresh and unsettled. He would stand over them for hours, his head bowed, as if in mourning for people he had never known. The town, in its desperation, began to debate the impossible. Was he a man? Was he a spirit? Was he an omen of some coming plague or disaster? A harbinger sent to walk among their dead as a warning? The preacher, his previous victory now turned to ashes in his mouth, had no answers. His faith was built on a clear distinction between the holy and the profane, but this silent, sorrowful figure defied all his categories. He was not a cackling demon or a ravenous monster. He was a quiet, persistent grief, a specter that could not be banished by prayer or violence. He was now more untouchable, more powerful than ever. His silence, which they had once mistaken for weakness, was now his greatest strength. It was absolute, unbreakable, and it was driving them all to the brink of madness. The climax of this psychological torment arrived through one of the youngest children in the town, the same little girl who had been found digging in her yard. She had been plagued by the dream more than any of the others. One afternoon, while she was supposed to be napping, she slipped out of her house, unnoticed. She did not wander aimlessly. She walked with a strange and unnerving purpose, her small legs carrying her directly to the cemetery. Her mother, discovering her missing a short time later, raised the alarm, and a small, frantic search party quickly formed. They found her on the far side of the cemetery, near the old stone wall where the man had first been seen after his return. She was standing in a sunken, overgrown patch of ground that was not marked by any headstone, a patch of earth the gravedigger had long ignored as unconsecrated and unsettled. The girl was not crying. She was calm, her expression serene. She was pointing at the ground at her feet, her small finger mirroring the exact gesture she had seen in her dreams. She looked up at her mother and the small group of assembled townsfolk, and she spoke a single, clear sentence that would shatter the fragile sanity of Allegheny forever. She said he was down there, and he was very sad. She then knelt down and, with a focus that was terrifying in its intensity, she began to pull at the weeds and dig into the soft, loamy earth with her small, determined hands. The haunting had finally led them to a destination. The silent man had pointed the way. And now, at long last, the community of Allegheny was about to unearth the terrible truth he had been trying to show them all along. The child's simple, declarative statement, delivered with the unnerving certainty that only the very young can possess, hung in the cold, still air of the cemetery. For a long moment, no one moved. The townsfolk, gathered around the small girl, were trapped between the ingrained instinct to dismiss her words as childish fantasy and the terrifying weight of the events that had preceded this moment. The dreams, the sightings, the strange, sorrowful persistence of the silent man's ghost it had, all led to this patch of forgotten earth. The girl's father, his face a mask of pale confusion, stepped forward and gently tried to pull her away. She resisted, her small hands clutching at the dark, rich soil, her gaze fixed on the ground as if she were seeing something just beneath the surface. It was the gravedigger who finally broke the spell of paralysis. He pushed his way through the small crowd, the handle of his shovel gripped tight in his hand. He was a man who had spent his life in the service of the town's dead, and he recognized the look of the land. He knew the subtle depressions and unsettling verdancy that spoke of disturbed and resettled earth. He looked at the spot where the child was digging, then at the faces of his neighbors, and in a voice rough with a dawning horror, he told them the girl was right. Someone was buried there, and they were not in a coffin. The reluctant, fearful excavation began. At first, only the gravedigger worked, his shovel slicing into the soil with grim, rhythmic thuds. The other men stood back, watching, a silent circle of unwilling witnesses. The sun began to dip below the mountain peaks, casting long, funereal shadows across the cemetery. The air grew colder. After several minutes of digging, the shovel struck something soft with a sickening, fleshy thud. The gravedigger recoiled, his breath hissing through his teeth. He dropped to his knees and began to claw at the earth with his bare hands. He pulled back a tattered piece of canvas, and the collective gasp from the onlookers was a single, unified sound of horror. It was a human hand, the skin pale and waxy in the fading light. The spell of inaction was broken. The other men, their faces ashen, surged forward, grabbing shovels and digging with a frantic, desperate energy. They were no longer just digging. They were exhuming a secret, uncovering a truth that had been festering just beneath the surface of their community. What they found in that shallow, unmarked grave would forever obliterate the simple, self-serving narrative they had constructed about the silent man. It was not one body, it was two. The first was the farmer, the man whose disappearance had been the catalyst for their violent crusade. The second, buried beneath him, was a traveling merchant who had passed through the area nearly a year prior and had been presumed to have simply moved on. Both men had been killed by the same method, a single, crushing blow to the back of the head. They had been murdered, stripped of their valuables, and dumped unceremoniously into this makeshift grave, their deaths a silent footnote in the town's history, unknown and unmourned. A profound, bone-deep silence fell over the cemetery, a quiet so absolute it seemed to absorb all sound, all thought. It was a silence heavier and more terrible than any the deaf man had ever imposed upon them. In that moment of horrifying revelation, everything became clear. The schoolteacher's frantic attempts at explanation, which they had dismissed as heresy, now echoed in their minds with the force of prophecy. The man's gestures were not a madman's ravings, they were a testimony. The chalk marks and carvings were not a curse, they were an indictment. He had been trying to tell them, he had been trying to show them, the symbols, the map of their past sorrows. It was all a desperate attempt to lead them to this very spot, to this uncovered grave. He was not the source of the darkness that had descended upon Allegheny. He was the only one who had seen it. He was the sole witness to a crime they had refused to believe had even happened. His every action, which they had interpreted through the distorted lens of their fear, was now cast in a new, tragic light. His lingering at their doorways was not a threat, but a plea for help. His miming at the children was not an attempt to lure them, but an effort to communicate with the only members of the community whose minds were not yet closed. His silence was not a weapon of intimidation, but the terrible, frustrating prison of a man who held the truth but lacked the voice to speak it. The most damning realization of all settled upon them as they stared into the open grave. The deaf man had known the killer. He had seen the murders, or at least discovered the bodies. He had known the face of the evil that was living among them, and in their blind, ignorant rage, they had not only silenced the witness, they had brutally attacked him and driven him away. They had destroyed their only chance of learning the truth, of achieving justice for the dead. The killer was not some spectral outsider. The killer was one of them. He was a member of their community, a man who had likely stood among them in the church, who had drank with them in the tavern, who had perhaps even joined the mob that had hunted the innocent messenger. The paranoia they had once directed at the silent stranger now turned inward, a corrosive acid that began to eat away at the bonds of trust that held their small community together. Every neighbor was now a potential suspect. Every friendly face now concealed a possible monster. They looked at each other, their eyes filled with a new and terrible suspicion. Who among them had the most to gain from the merchant's disappearance? Who had held a grudge against the farmer? Who had been the loudest voice calling for the deaf man's banishment? The questions were a poison, and there was no antidote. They had turned on the one person who could have saved them from themselves. They had mistaken a desperate cry for help for a declaration of war. By refusing to listen to his silence, they had condemned themselves to a lifetime of suspicion and guilt. The community of Allegheny had been haunted not by a silent man, but by its own ignorance, its own deep-seated fear of the unknown. The horror was not that an evil had come to their town, but that it had been born from within it, and they had been its willing accomplices. The deaf man was never seen again. After leading them to the grave, his spectral purpose fulfilled, he vanished from Allegheny as mysteriously as he had arrived. He left behind no name, no history, only the profound and enduring legacy of his silence. The killer of the farmer and the merchant was never found. The town, fractured by mistrust and poisoned by guilt, slowly began to wither. Families moved away, unable to live with the ghosts of their actions, unable to look their neighbors in the eye. The coal seam eventually ran dry, and the economic heart of the town ceased to beat. Allegheny was left to the mountains, a collection of rotting cabins and a cemetery full of secrets, a monument to a community that had been damned by its own refusal to listen. The silence he left behind was his true and final message. It was a silence that would echo for generations, a perpetual reminder of the day they chose the comfort of a simple lie over the terrifying complexity of the truth. The case file on the Silent Man of Allegheny is now closed. Subscribe to the Blasphemy Archive to stand among those present when the next is opened, and leave your thoughts on what you have witnessed.